The content of this educational video is backed by citations, which will be shown at the bottom of the screen. However, we will be describing a historical tragedy, which means some of you may find this topic disturbing. I won't be showing any graphic pictures, but nonetheless, you may want to sit this one out if you are of a sensitive nature. On the 29th of October 1921, a baby boy was born in Germany called Theodor Wiesenberger. It's not clear, but the nurse may have put the wrong drops in his eyes shortly after birth. But either way, Theodor was blind. He would listen intently to his grandfather playing the fiddle, but during the height of the hyperinflation in 1923, when the family had not eaten for several days, Fritz's violin, built by the famous 17th century maker Jacob Stainer, was exchanged for a sack of potatoes, a sack of flour, and 2 pounds of butter. When he was 7, Theodor was taken in by Franciscan nuns in Augsburg, but was later moved to schools for the blind. But as Theodor was with the Franciscan nuns, a conference was being held at Nuremberg where one man expressed his views on the disabled.
Through our modern sentimental humanitarianism, we make an effort to maintain the weak at the expense of the healthy. Criminals are allowed to reproduce. Degenerates are laboriously coddled in an artificial way. Thus, we slowly grow the weak and kill the strong. If Germany gained 1 million children a year, and eliminated 700,000 to 800,000 of the weakest, then the final result would probably be an increase in strength. The most dangerous thing is for us to cut ourselves off from the natural process of selection.
That's right, Hitler was suggesting in 1929 that it was probably a good thing to murder 7 or 8 out of every 10 newly born babies. And it wasn't just Hitler. Charles Darwin was one of the pioneers of the theory of evolution, which he called natural selection. But his brother-in-law, Francis Galton, changed natural selection into rational selection and coined the term eugenics, which is the idea that we can get to a higher, new social man if the elite can select those who breed and those who die. In effect, it was a justification for the elite to rule over man by their holy gnosis.
The infamous T4 program originated from the belief that the German people needed to be cleansed of racially unsound elements. Eugenics and euthanasia were indistinguishable and inseparable policies originating from the concept of Volkskörper, or body politic, which regarded a doctor's duty to the race and nation as prioritised over the doctor's duty to any individual.
If we view society as a giant social organism, a body, corpse, or corporation, with many individual cells, then the elite and the medical community believed that it was their duty to remove the infected cells from the social organism. This would, it was thought, lead to a healthier superorganism. And this idea was embraced all over the world, and still is. This isn't confined to the Nazis. The Americans, British, the Soviets all had laws on their books which promoted this idea.
The Nazi 1933 Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring was a verbatim copy of Harry H. Laughlin's Model Eugenical Sterilization Law in the United States. 400,000 people were involuntarily sterilized throughout Germany as a result of this law, which was enacted on the 1st of January 1934.
And these weren't just mentally disabled, but alcoholics, paupers, women of the night, also known as professionals, feminists, people with epilepsy and cancer, and even people who like to debate en masse. Thank you, YouTube censorship.
As a child, Paul Eggert begged from local farmers, and if he didn't return home with food, then his alcoholic father beat him. Eventually, as he put it, the local people had enough of it. So he was taken away from his parents and put in a special children's home near Dortmund, where he was told that he needed to have a hernia operation. It wasn't until after the war that he learned that he had not had an operation for a hernia, but had been sterilized. In 1935, the psychiatrist Dr. Karl Knab wrote that German asylums contained not just idiots of the lowest level, but spiritual ruins. Moreover, this patient material should be eradicated by being killed in a painless fashion. This was justifiable, said Dr. Knab, for financial reasons in the context of a nation fighting for its very existence. No doctor was ever ordered to participate in the euthanasia program. They came of their own volition. The realization of this fact devastates the pedestrian myth of the coerced German doctor. Racial hygiene was the creation of German medical science and not the National Socialists, as the popular history of the regime otherwise insinuates.
And by the time we get to the Nazi era, most of the pieces of the puzzle were in place. Hitler only had to give the green light to the medical community, which is what he did. The National Socialist state dived into your family history to determine whom you could or could not marry, whether the baby you carried was racially useful or not, and if it was, you weren't allowed to abort it. You couldn't choose your place of work, it was chosen for you, and you couldn't even choose your friends. If your neighbours disapproved, you were denounced as asocial. The state was in total social control of your lives. Well, on the 29th of February 1939, a disabled baby boy was born in the village of Pomsen near Leipzig. Baby Kretschmar was blind and was lacking a leg and part of an arm. They also suspected he was feeble-minded, but there was no way for them to know this that early on, so it was just a suspicion. The parents, Richard and Lena Kretschmar, were both National Socialists, and Richard wanted his son to die. So sometime in May or June 1939, he sent a petition to Hitler asking for baby Kretschmar to be mercy-killed. Hitler sent his SS doctor Karl Brandt to speak to the parents and doctors at the University of Leipzig's Children's Clinic. Hitler instructed Brandt to authorize the doctors to euthanize the child if he was truly as deformed and disabled as described, and baby Kretschmar was murdered on the 25th of July 1939.
That is several months later than had previously been thought, and offers further evidence that Hitler believed the forthcoming war would provide useful cover for drastic action against the disabled.
When Brandt returned to see Hitler, the Führer gave him verbal instructions to kill more disabled children, not just babies, and an organisation was set up to fulfill this task. This was given the Orwellian name the Charitable Foundation for Cure and Institutional Care. It morphed over time, but its headquarters was based in a villa in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4, which is where the code name for the operation came from, T4. 117 people worked for the organisation, and a committee was formed to determine whether a disabled child should live or die. However, the Aktion T4 personnel were not acting alone. The doctors and nurses at the hospitals and asylums were the ones selecting their own patients for euthanasia. On the 18th of August 1939, registration of all disabled children became compulsory, guidelines were created, and doctors and midwives were given 2 Reichsmarks for each child they reported, incentivizing them to commit the crimes. Worse, the victims weren't just those already in the hospitals, but those who were living at home with their parents.
The parents were informed that the children would be well looked after, or even that removal to a specialist clinic held out the promise of a cure, or at least an improvement in their condition. Given the hereditary bias of the diagnoses, a large proportion of the families were poor and ill-educated, and a good proportion of them were already stigmatized as asocial or hereditarily inferior. Those who raised objections to the removal of their offspring from the family home were sometimes threatened with withdrawal of benefits if they did not comply.
A panel of 3 doctors in Berlin would decide whether the child would live or die, and each doctor marked the document for each child with a blue minus or a red plus. If the child had 2 or more red pluses, they would be murdered. And I do think it's interesting that a red plus, or red cross, was the selected symbol of death in this instance. Also, while they did have certain criteria that they were supposed to assess the victims with, it was all arbitrary and practically impossible. Nurses were submitting loads of forms and many weren't filled in very well, with missing details. There was no way for these so-called doctors to make a proper assessment.
Herman van Müller, for instance, evaluated over 2,000 patients between the 12th of November and the 1st of December 1940, or an average of 121 a day, while at the same time carrying out his duties as director of the state hospital at Egelfing-Haar. Another expert, Josef Schreck, completed 15,000 forms from April 1940 to the end of the year, sometimes processing up to 400 a week, also in addition to his other hospital duties. Neither man could have spent more than a few seconds to take the decision on life or death in each case. Once condemned, the victim was put in a special ward where he or she was starved to death or given a daily overdose of the sedative luminol in their food. Within a few days, the child usually developed a severe chest infection, which led to death. In order to speed up the process, the children were sometimes injected with a lethal dose of morphine. After a lapse of several weeks, their parents were informed that their child was dead. A fictional illness was cited on the death certificate as the cause.
It was Hitler's personal physician, Theo Morell, who had suggested that the parents would prefer it if the deaths were recorded as resulting from natural causes. Oh, and when they decided that the children should die from starvation, they wouldn't just stop feeding them all of a sudden. No, they would slowly reduce their rations, prolonging the suffering. Not that it would matter if they were full of sedatives, because they wouldn't feel it. Assuming luminol works the same way as midazolam, which is what the NHS uses. And I want to emphasise this. All the historians, Rees, Evans, Ian Kershaw, Sarman, say that the doctors were not coerced into performing the murders. They did it of their own volition, and saw it as a good thing. They were also allowed to excuse themselves from the killings if they felt too weak to do it, but most actually were in favour of it, and came up with various reasons to commit the acts. Apart from the financial savings of not having to feed and house disabled people, they believed they were cutting the cancer out of the social organism, purifying the Hegelian spirit of society.
Without the killing of the incurable, the healing of the majority of the sick and the improvement of the nation's health would be impossible. Many of those doctors involved spoke with pride of their work even after the war, maintaining that they had been contributing to human progress.
Germany meant more to them than the individual, and to protect the German blood, they had to prevent degeneration and later race mixing. Aktion T4 really was the testbed for what came later with the Jews, and it was the medical scientists who invented the idea of racial hygiene in the first place. So to say that they weren't willing participants is false. The physicians really were pioneers, not pawns, and to these social scientists, the individual was only of biological value if they were deemed to fit with the collectivist concept of the body politic, the Volkskörper.
Historians like to paint Nazism as a street-level mob mentality. In hindsight, the evidence proves that the scientific community was fully engaged and ready for these eugenic measures. To the contrary, it was the layman, the German public, that needed convincing. The general public was never supposed to find out what was happening to the children inside these special units. But within the walls of the hospital, it was difficult to hide the evidence of the crime.
One witness spoke of how a nurse would come into the dining room during supper and select the desired children. The next morning, they were taken to a consulting room, supposedly to be immunised against a certain disease, but in reality, they were never seen again. The witness described how some of the children would hold on to others in an attempt to remain, and some would scream and glance back as they were taken away with a look of terror on their faces. But it wasn't just children. Hitler asked Dr. Leonardo Conti, State Secretary for Health, to target adults as well. But after some scheming, Philipp Buhler, chief of the Chancellery of the Führer, managed to take over the entire Aktion T4 program. His deputy was Victor Brack, who had once been Himmler's chauffeur. Neither of these men had medical qualifications, but it didn't matter because they weren't curing anyone here. This medical action had nothing to do with medicine. To fully understand how this came to pass, it's important to realise that the National Socialist regime was not bound by German law. It was operating by its own rules. And so, while the doctors were on board with what was happening, they were happy to kill, many of them were hesitant at first, knowing that they were breaking the law. Brack, for example, was using a pseudonym, a different name, to protect himself, and many of the murderers wanted official backing from the law. So Hitler had to write a letter to give an air of legitimacy to the program, and we actually have the letter he sent at the time, now known as the Euthanasia Decree.
Reichsleiter Buhler and Dr. Brandt MD are charged with the responsibility of enlarging the authority of certain physicians to be designated by name in such a manner that persons who, according to human judgment, are incurable can, upon a most careful diagnosis of their condition of sickness, be accorded a mercy death. Adolf Hitler.
I'd just like to point out that this letter by Hitler was written in October 1939, but backdated to the 1st of September, the day the war began. It also had his signature on it, making it authentic. It's actually a rare act because Hitler didn't like to put pen to paper when it came to his crimes.
It suited neither Hitler's style nor his instinct to transmit lethal orders in writing. The reason he did so on this one and only occasion was because of the difficulties in a land where the writ of law was still presumed to run, already being encountered by those attempting, without any obvious authority, to build an organisation in conditions of secrecy to implement a murderous mandate.
And this letter is even more important because it is the only piece of physical evidence tying Hitler to the murders that came later. We know he stated some of his intentions in Mein Kampf and that he gave verbal orders to his subordinates, referring to his victims as life unworthy of life, but this is the only physical evidence of him giving an order to kill, so it is pretty important. But with this order, Philipp Buhler and Victor Brack were able to organise the killing of adults as well as children. They estimated that 70,000 needed to be murdered, and this was too many to be killed by their previous methods of overdose and starvation. So Brack asked the head of the criminal police, Arthur Neber, for advice. Neber pointed him in the direction of Dr. Albert Widmann, who ran the chemical department of the Criminal Technical Institute, who was the one who suggested that carbon monoxide was the best killing agent.
On the 4th of January 1940, Dr. Widmann conducted a gassing experiment in Brandenburg an der Havel, at a prison converted into a euthanasia unit. The gassings took place in a tiled room with fake water pipes along the ceiling. Once the patients were locked inside the pretend shower room, Widmann personally turned on the valve to release the gas from bottles of carbon monoxide.
Dr. Brandt later described the gassings as more humane than injections, which was false, and believed that this was a major advance in medical history. Therefore, he said he acted in good conscience as he proceeded to organise the killings. And Theodor Wiesenberger, the child who was possibly blinded by a nurse at birth, was one of those animals in human form now selected for a mercy death.
On the 14th of November 1940, 2 weeks and 2 days after his 19th birthday, Theodor Wiesenberger was collected from Schloss Schweinspoint with his fellow victims and driven by bus to the psychiatric hospital at Günzburg.
Even if you personally managed to stay calm, they knew exactly what was happening. It was terrible, indescribable. It was particularly bad for the girls who instinctively understood everything. They cried and screamed, clinging to the nurses, tearing off their veils. The doctors and nurses also wept.
The buses were called charitable ambulances, showing that you should always look at the actions, not the words. Rumours quickly spread throughout the asylums and care homes, and horrifyingly, the majority of the disabled weren't actually mentally ill. Many were just physically disabled, and so they knew what was going to happen. In some cases, it's probable that they were told by the staff.
I'm again living in a state of fear because the cars were here again. They took so many people away once more, where one would not have thought. We were all so upset that we all cried.
Staff started giving patients sedatives to keep them calm, so patients refused and started physically resisting, which resulted in brutal retaliation from the staff. Once at the hospital, the victims were ordered to undress and were then killed with carbon monoxide gassing over a course of about 20 minutes. And just to make sure we're all aware,
the patient's death was anything but peaceful or humane.
The blind Theodore supposedly died of meningitis. In fact, he had been killed at Grafenegg, one of the 6 euthanasia centres. Gold teeth were extracted from the victims, organs were harvested, and the bodies were shipped to the nearby crematoriums.
The brains of children killed at Brandenburg were sent to Professor Julius Hallervorden, head of the neuropathology department of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Brain Research in Berlin. Dr. Irmfried Erbel's notebook records that Professor Hallervorden even visited Brandenburg and took part in autopsies conducted at the killing centre. Afterwards, the communal ashes were crammed into urns, although care was taken not to pack a notional child's too full. If the family wanted the urn, it was sent to them by post at an exorbitant charge.
The doctors delayed telling the victims' families of the death, partly to make it look like they died of natural causes, and partly because they could still collect money from the families for the victims' supposed upkeep.
Of course, the administrators had to take great care not to send too many letters to the same town in the same time frame and quoting the same cause of death.
But the sheer number of deaths raised suspicions, plus in some cases the public witnessed the patients fighting as they were being pulled into the buses, causing local protests. The victims' families wrote to the hospitals asking for clarity since the details and circumstances didn't add up. And in November 1940, the Reichsminister for Justice, Franz Gärtner, was being pressured by the Catholic Church to look into the deaths. Now, Gärtner was not an original Nazi. He had been a member of the DNVP until it was dissolved in June 1933. He had been appointed to the position of Reichsminister of Justice by von Papen, but retained his position in government as an independent, and then only joined the National Socialist Party in 1937. So Gärtner was more of a conservative authoritarian and probably not entirely on board with Nazi ideology. He was one of those who believed that the National Socialist regime would fail, allowing Germany to return to normalcy, which is why he also put blocks in the way of the Nazis.
Gärtner achieved individual successes in the defence of legal principles. Thus, in trials against clergymen 1935 to 1939, he was able to assure relatively fair treatment and at times to impose punishment upon party members.
Of course, Gärtner wasn't a straight arrow. He did have to work within the regime, and according to Wikipedia, he was the one who coined the term Gleichschaltung, which was the synchronization of the society and economy with the state. Hitler and the party took part in the ceremony for his death in 1941, which shows that he was in with them enough for them to want to do that. And apparently in the early years of the Reich, he wanted to subordinate the concentration camps to legal control and was trying to impose limitations on the power of the SS and the Gestapo. So this guy wasn't perfect, but he was working within the regime to limit the regime. Well, when the Catholic Church suspected the deliberate killing of the disabled, Gärtner started to look into the matter. There was no basis in the law for these mercy killings, and thus Gertner was beginning to push back against it, thinking that the party itself was the one committing these crimes. But he was wrong. Hitler's letter, the euthanasia decree, was shown to him, and he realised that Hitler himself wanted this. He had no chance of blocking or regulating the killings if Hitler himself was ordering them to be done, so Gertner backed down. Then another judge, Lothar Kressig, wrote letters of protest against the killings, and just like Gertner, he was also shown Hitler's letter by State Secretary Roland Freisler. But Kressig stood his ground, saying whether Hitler was involved or not, it was still wrong. He sent letters to the hospitals telling them that what they were doing was illegal and that he would take legal action, and so Gertner had to step in.
If you cannot recognise the will of the Führer as a source of law, as a basis of law, then you cannot remain a judge.
Kressig was retired from his position, the only judge to stand by his principles and try and stop the campaign, and it helped that he was a member of the Confessing Church, which was Protestant in nature. And this incident shows us just how powerful the Führer had become. Laws in Nazi Germany really meant nothing. What mattered was the will of the leader and the whim of the party. Their actions spoke louder than words. But something to note was that Gertner's conscience seems to have been playing upon him, and other Nazis took notice.
A month later, during an official tour of Nazi-occupied Poland, Hans Frank, governor of the district, noted Gertner's deep distress, presumably at the treatment of Jews and Poles. Immediately upon Gertner's return to Berlin, he was hospitalised and died of an undiagnosed illness, amid rumours that he had been poisoned.
Even though the legal resistance had been bypassed, the Catholic and Protestant churches remained suspicious. These churches actually ran a number of hospitals and care homes themselves, and resisted as best they could the registration and transfer of their patients. In July 1940, a Protestant bishop wrote to the Interior Minister, Wilhelm Frick, asking if Hitler knew about the killings, but got no reply. The Catholic bishop Heinrich Wienken wrote a letter to Hans Lamars, chief of the Reich Chancellery, stating that the fifth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," had to be upheld, and warned that the church would go public if the murder program continued. Some pastors point-blank refused to cooperate with the authorities, and the local Nazi leaders were hesitant to do anything because they knew it would spark a backlash. On the 19th of September 1940, a British aircraft dropped a bomb on one of these hospitals, prompting Goebbels to ask how the British could be so horrid as to attack a Christian charity. Well, one of the pastors responded,
"Should I condemn the deed of the English, and shortly afterwards take part in an infanticide on a far greater scale at Bethel?"
The American reporter William Shirer, who later wrote the popular book in the 1960s, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, was also looking into the killings. He found out that Hitler had written the order that was making it happen. Well, some of the church leaders couldn't believe this, and Pastor Paul Gerhard Brauner sent a document to Hitler detailing the murders and asked him to stop them. He was then arrested by the Gestapo in August 1940, and after promising to stop his protests, was released at the end of October. The problem was that the Christian churches had been persecuted so much by the Nazis that they weren't in a great position to resist anyway. Many of their organisations had been closed down, and some of their clergy were in the camps. Worse, some Christians weren't against the killings, and others weren't sure if they should even question the state, since it was a legitimate and legal entity. Some worried that if they did protest, that would give the National Socialists all the excuse they needed to double down their efforts against the churches, so they could only do so much. But inside the Catholic Church, pressure was building. With patients being taken from Catholic hospitals and care homes, it became increasingly obvious what was happening, and messages went back and forth between the various leaders of the church discussing the situation. On the 2nd of December 1940, the Vatican finally made its voice heard.
The direct killing of an innocent person because of mental or physical defects is not allowed.
Still, the Catholics in Germany at this time were hesitant to take action out of fear of reprisals. However, the Catholic Bishop of Munster, Clemens August von Galen, was of a different character than some of the others who had protested before him. He published the Vatican's message in his official newsletter in March 1941, the month when child allowances for handicapped children were no longer paid out, to incentivise the poor families to hand over their disabled children to the state.
Notifications about deaths in the mental care facility in Hadamar have recently increased. Supposedly incurable patients are being brought to this institution, and they are soon to begin building a crematorium.
Galen then gave sermons throughout July attacking the regime and the Gestapo for seizing church properties, arresting its members, and for the euthanasia crimes they were committing.
The police attempted to intimidate Galen into silence by raiding the nunnery where his sister Helena von Galen was based, arresting her and confining her to a cellar. Undaunted, however, she escaped by climbing out of a window.
On the 28th of July 1941, the first carbon monoxide killings at Auschwitz occurred, and on that day, Friedrich Kellner wrote this in his diary.
The mental hospitals have become murder centres. As I learned, a family brought their mentally deranged son back home from an institution. After some time, they received a letter from the sanatorium informing them their son had died, and his cremated ashes were being sent to them. The office clerk had forgotten to strike this boy's name from the death list. From that oversight, the intended and premeditated murder came to light.
Just days later, in early August 1941, Clemens August von Galen held a sermon where he openly denounced the Aktion T4 killings, going further than any church leader had done so far.
For some months, we have been hearing reports that inmates of establishments for the care of the mentally ill who have been ill for a long period and perhaps appear incurable have been forcibly removed from these establishments on orders from Berlin. Regularly, the relatives receive, soon afterwards, an intimation that the patient is dead, that the patient's body has been cremated, and that they can collect the ashes. There is a general suspicion, verging on certainty, that these numerous unexpected deaths of the mentally ill do not occur naturally, but are intentionally brought about in accordance with the doctrine that it is legitimate to destroy a so-called worthless life. In other words, to kill innocent men and women, if it is thought that their lives are of no further value to the people and the state.
Huh. What a conspiracy theorist. Don't you know that conspiracies don't exist?
Since the body is immediately cremated, the relatives and the criminal police are unable to establish whether the patient had in fact been ill or what the cause of death actually was. We are concerned with men and women, our fellow creatures, our brothers and sisters. Poor human beings, ill human beings, they are unproductive, if you will. But does that mean that they have lost the right to live? Have you, have I, the right to live only so long as we are productive, so long as we are recognised by others as productive?
It's worth emphasising that the main backlash against the Nazis was coming from the Catholic Church. Why? Well, there is a theory out there that says that the Nazi movement was Catholic, or at least Christian, and entire books have been written to prove this. I'm not saying that all Christians were united, clearly not, and not all were against the Nazis, but one of the largest opposition movements to Hitler, and one of his biggest roadblocks, was the Catholic Church, and here we have a bishop openly protesting the killings.
Thou shalt not kill. God wrote this commandment in the conscience of man long before any penal code laid down the penalty for murder, long before there was any prosecutor or any court to investigate and avenge the murder. Cain, who killed his brother Abel, was a murderer long before there were any states or any courts of law.
But no, only the state can create laws. Anyway, the Catholic Church had already protested when the Nazi Gauleiter Adolf Wagner had ordered all crucifixes to be taken down in schools. In addition to demonstrations, petitions and meetings, Catholic women wrote to their sons and husbands on the Eastern Front to complain about what was happening, and a lot weren't happy. So Galen's new protest was coming off the back of that one and was really good timing. Galen's sermons were distributed throughout the church, the British got a copy, and they broadcasted it over the radio and dropped leaflets over Germany and other parts of Europe. And despite some retaliatory actions by the Gestapo, the backlash was growing. Other church leaders were now beginning to make their voices heard as well, and we can actually see why Hitler was so obsessed about keeping the citizens happy, especially since he believed in the stab in the back idea from the First World War. Hitler and the other Nazi leaders wanted to take Galen down, but realised that he was too popular a person to do that, and they feared that Galen would become a martyr if they took action against him. Instead, a film was shown in August 1941 where there was a lengthy discussion about the pros and cons of euthanasia. People either rejected it completely or thought it was justified if someone voluntarily wanted to die. Some believed that involuntary euthanasia of the feeble-minded should only occur with the consent of the rest of the family, but none of them agreed to the murder of people against their will, which was what was happening in the T4 program. The feedback was clear, and so the backlash from the Catholic Church forced Hitler to officially stop the program on the 24th of August 1941. Between September 1939 and August 1941, the Aktion T4 program had officially killed 70,273 people. But the actual number was higher because we know there were additional victims, so some estimate it was probably about 90,000. However, this was just the official end of the killings, not the actual end of the killings. While the carbon monoxide gassings of adults stopped, unfortunately, the starvation and fatal injections of children continued in secret, and additional policies were enacted that promoted the killings. In September 1941, a policy was passed whereby those parents who had previously refused to hand over their disabled children were now to have their children forcibly removed from them. Just imagine that. And by the end of the war, about 275,000 people were murdered in total, and I think most of them were children. But with the official ending of the program, the murderers who operated the carbon monoxide chambers were mostly unemployed. So the doctors now travelled to the Eastern Front to euthanize injured soldiers. At first glance, this doesn't make sense. Why would they target those who had fought for Germany and who had only fallen in battle rather than, having been born deformed and so on? And Salmon, for example, is confused by this. But the reason why is because this isn't a program of science, it's a program based on religion. Those that fell in battle were no longer fit, and therefore no longer pure in soul. And since the body organism was what was important, the individual bad cell must die so that goddess society may live. So when you view this from a purely scientific point of view, it makes no sense. You have to recognise the religious elements of the movement. The Aktion T4 program gave the Nazis experience on how to deal with a public backlash and how to perform sizable murder operations. Hitler learned that he actually could murder large numbers of people so long as he didn't put pen to paper and that he kept it as secret as possible. This was the basis for what was to come in the near future. The doctors and nurses, drivers and orderlies who had delivered their victims to the shower rooms and turned the valves on the disabled would, once again, willingly participate in the crimes of the Reich, all in the name of their society.
Medical doctors were not coerced or conscripted to work at Auschwitz. Auschwitz was conscripted to work for the civilian doctors and scientists. Thanks for watching, bye for now.